running from his job to get here on time. I'll open our work session tonight. We're here to receive the final report and recommendations from the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience on the exercise that they helped us with. History is, as no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. And it does not refer merely, or even principally, to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. I did not write those wise words. James Baldwin did. In his 1965 collected nonfiction called The Price of the Ticket. But it is precisely this recognition of how our history affects us today that our community has wrestled with over the past year, even more than a year. We appreciate all who have participated, who have shared their stories and their concerns. From the moment the question of what to do with the auction right block was raised, the City Council has held first a public hearing, then an extended online comment, and ultimately this series of public forums led for us by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. It's a proud moment for Fredericksburg that our community has been willing to undertake this exercise. We look forward to the presentation tonight of the summary of what has been said and hoped and dreamed, and the recommendations not only for the auction block, but also for continuing the dialogue and for doing a better job of telling and living our history. So with that, Mr. Fry, if you want to chime in, and then we should introduce our, and although who Dina and Braden I think are known to all by now, familiar faces about town.
All right. Thank you, Mayor Greenlaw. And excuse me, everybody. I'm on my UPS adrenaline right now. I've been on like 12 hours straight, so I'm trying to get it together here. But what I want to do, Mayor, if you don't mind, I want to kind of, for a few minutes, just lead us up to how we got to this point in the early stages, and then I'll turn it back over to you. And you can do formal introductions and all of that, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
All right, thank you. This all started in, I'm saying this tonight because I want to make sure we get the storyline straight of how it started. But it was some things going on in Charlottesville, and throughout the whole process, I didn't want to reference Charlottesville because at that time it was major in the U.S. period, and being so close to Fredericksburg. It was critical timing of what was happening. And what happened was we had a conversation. It was the mayor. I talked to the mayor, Mr. Baruti, back then, and I was kind of on fire and kind of nervous for our city at the time. And that's the reality of what happened. And I was like, well, what's going to happen here? And then rumors started spreading of the slave auction block in Fredericksburg. And coincidentally, within the conversation time frame of that week, I was thinking, put this on the agenda, and still trying to do it the right way, because the major concern at that time for myself was the city safety and what ifs at that time. So we were going to place it on the agenda, and then waited till Monday to put it on the agenda for Tuesday's meeting. And in the meantime, a group or somebody came down from, I think, Washington, D.C., and was trying to stir up some stuff in the city about the slave block with valid points. And I wanted to make sure that we as a city had control over what was or what could be. So there was a march on the weekend before that council meeting, but I just want the public to know that it was already in the works. And as you can see tonight, there's nobody here that was from that march, especially the organizers from D.C. at that moment. There's nobody here now, and that's exactly what I was afraid of, because somebody could come to your town, tear it up, and you're left with, what's left. So put it on the agenda and for Tuesday. So I'm trying to sum this up the best way I can. We decided to review this and open it up to the public, which created a huge dialogue, which has never happened here in Fredericksburg. And we did all kinds of community meetings, and we held a big event, public, opening up the door to public at James Monroe High School. And we took comments and so on and so forth, and then eventually it came back to council for a vote. And there was a couple of options there. And so long story short, after the vote, which did not remove the slave block, after the vote, the council then decided as a group to hire the firm and see where we could go with this. So the first phase of all of this, which I just explained, we did on our own as a city, and kudos to the city. And in the meantime, if somebody came here from somewhere else and wanted to ask what was going on with the slave block and so on and so forth, we already were proactively taking care of that. So with that being said, without me dragging out the history of it, I just wanted to make those points. And with that being said, obviously, the council decided to take this journey on. And it feels like a year later, we're here today with the final report. And Mayor Greenlaw, I'll turn it back over to you. I just wanted the public to know what led us here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chubb. Yeah, it was Mr. Barodi who knew about the International Sites of Conscience, and we actually took a train ride up to New York and met with them and came right back. We didn't spend much taxpayers' money, but we wanted to interview them on their own turf, and we did. Mr. Barodi, you want to add anything at this time before I introduce?
Sure, Madam Mayor. I don't have much to add. I think you well laid out the brief history over the past 15 months or so. I think it's been a good process. I've been very encouraged by the more than 250 or so participants over the year. I think it's been an exceptional conversation, and it's really just the beginning. As folks know, the city is committed to action. This report will highlight recommendations, of course. So I'll let Dina and Braden talk about action, but we've got some more work to do for sure. It's wrapped up in these recommendations, so I look forward to this journey continuing for years to come. Again, we have more work to do, as you've acknowledged, and Mr. Fry, I'm sure, would support. With that, I'd be happy to introduce Braden and Dina. They have been with us this entire journey from the beginning in phase one. We scoped a process that included 3 phases. One was essentially an audit of what we do in the city, identified obvious things that we could do better. And phase 2 talked a bit about the slave block and the specific location of Charles and William Street. And then thirdly, the third phase unraveled last fall with conversations about sort of what's next. So I'm excited to obviously be here at this point, again, to start the next chapter of this conversation. With that, I think I would simply turn it back to Dina and Braden to walk us through their final report and recommendations, and then I'll look forward to a council conversation about the matter. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Dina Bailey, and I'm here with Braden, who will introduce himself soon. Just as a caveat, Braden and I may, in fact, get up and walk around a little bit, knowing that this isn't a formal session. It's a working session for you all, so that we can also see the community that we've been working with for so many months. So we want to acknowledge them, and we'll get up and do that as well, trying to keep the cameras insight as well, so that we have this videotaped as you all want it. The International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is headquartered in New York City, though Braden and I live in separate cities as well. And our organization is a membership organization where we have over 250 member sites in 65 different countries. And the thing that brings all of them together is this understanding that when we connect the past and the present together, we can make more just and humane decisions for the future. And so while all of these organizations and communities are thinking about different topics and different time periods and getting funding from different sources, they all have that in common, that motivation, that intention. And so when we work with organizations and when we work with communities, that is part of what we do as well. We try to connect the past to the present to help make better decisions for the future. And so that is what led us here to Fredericksburg. That was part of the decision that we made to partner as well, right? So we contracted with you, but that was why we wanted to come and be a part of this. And so as Mr. Baruti already said, there were 3 different phases for the initiative. The first phase took approximately 3 months, the second phase took another 3 months, and the third phase also 3 months. So kind of keeping in mind those specific areas. There were a few different objectives that we had for Fredericksburg as well, which is laid out in the report, but to provide a little bit of depth about that.
Can you go to the slides so that folks can be...
Is there a way to do that?
That's up. Okay.
So skipping past, yes. All right, so in terms of the initiative that we had with the community, in partnership with the community, we want people to more deeply recognize the historical narratives that were currently being told and how they affect then contemporary discussion. So sometimes when we are focusing in a community, the two things are very separate. That what is being told in our CVB, our historical markers, our brochures, our tours, when those things are being told, sometimes they're very different from what is happening contemporarily in terms of community discussion. Sometimes those are the same. And so we wanted to help the community recognize that. We also wanted to be able to reimagine the space that surrounds the slave auction block. So our intention was never to say it should be here or it should not be here, but it was to help the community really think about their motives, what they wanted for that space, right? Because when you know what you want, then you can figure out what to actually put there in terms of interpretation. And then we wanted everyone to come together to better recognize the varied perspectives of their fellow community members. So additionally, when people are in heated conversation about things, they often think that everyone sees their point or should see their point from the same perspective that they have it. And it is really, really important as we move forward for people to say, oh, I had never thought about that, or that's a really good point. And so getting people to recognize the varied perspectives within the community was really important to us as well. All right, so just as a review of the different phases, the first group was really based on affinity. So by identity groupings, we had business groups come together, we had religious groups come together, etc. People were able to give their personal experiences in a relatively safe space, people who probably thought similarly to themselves. In phase 2, we brought groups together in larger settings so that we really could start to look at the differences in perspectives and how we come together to have a shared vision of these. And then in phase 3, that was the process of continuing to grow the collaboration, but really to say, where do we have consensus? Where do we still have disagreement? To help think about what the next steps forward would be.
So everyone, hello, I'm Braden, and you kept the mic further away from your face than I did. So, hello to everyone again tonight. It's good to see folks. For folks who have spent time with us before, you're going to see this and say, ground rules. They always do ground rules, even at informal working sessions. So just a couple things that we wanted everybody to keep in mind as we start to talk and share and discuss tonight. Right. One is that even in a moment, as we go through these moments of big possibility and exploration, and then we together and gather our thoughts, even spaces where we're gathering our thoughts stay learning spaces, right? When we give you all a report, it's not about looking for, I'm right, they're wrong, did the coalition side with me or against me, right? This is about trying to keep learning and seeing a lot of the different pieces that come out of this, and that we can all keep getting better at every part of this as we go through. And the other is that as we go through this, I would imagine as folks read the report, there are going to be parts of it that are challenging for everybody. Everybody's going to have something that's challenging. Everybody's going to have something that they are excited about in there. So as people experience that, coming in and out there, as people experience that, right, we hope that you hold each other accountable for really leaning into the parts that are challenging to you, right? Expect that of others. If something's hard, if it's not what they wanted to hear, hope that people will hold them accountable for listening to that. If you expect that of others, we also ask you to then hold yourself accountable to that too, right? And expect yourself to pay attention to the parts that are challenging. All right, we'll try this. All right. Switching mics already. These make sense to everybody? Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so some big picture takeaways, right? And so in reflecting on statements during phase one, people saw change, right? That's one of the biggest takeaways that doesn't always happen in a discussion like this that we were really excited to see, right? That people's capacity to talk to each other and to work together increased over this time period, right? And that's going to be one of the most valuable things for people going forward, is that you have a greater ability to continue to do this work. You've increased the amount that you can make happen, right? And that is important because, as I think every other person who has spoken so far tonight has mentioned, there remains work to do, right? And that includes disagreements about location, what aspects of the story to focus on, who will have control of the process. And there's the needed ability to continue building trust between community members and between community members and the government, right? Challenges, but the capacity to address each of those has grown, right? And as we think about the block itself and the challenges around the block, keep in mind that every one of the challenges that has shown up around the block is not unique to the block itself, but is instead, it is a reflection of a larger set of challenges that the community faces, right? And so that the reason we often pay attention to history, and one of the ways we find the power in history, is that it has the ability to coalesce those larger challenges that are sometimes difficult to take on elsewhere and make them a little bit more accessible, a little bit more tangible as we look at a particular object in a particular moment, right? So when you see a challenge, when you see those remaining works, we hope that you think of taking those on as part of taking on each of those in a wider way for the community at large. Okay, so thinking about phase three, because we've given reports about phase one and phase two, so people have heard some of the pieces that have come out of that. We're not going to review all of those tonight, but we wanted to give you a little bit of, hey, what did we see come out of phase three, right? So we saw a number of points of convergence where people are coming together, and we saw points of divergence. That's okay. That's a good place to be, right? In the writing itself, the points of divergence really receive a little bit more attention than the points of convergence, right? Because where people are agreeing, we can kind of share that and move forward. The places that people are disagreeing, those need a little bit more nuance to understand those. Just because we spend more time on it doesn't mean that's the dominant theme of it, but they just take a few more words to explain. Right? The challenges are significant and real, but they are not unaddressable or particularly unexpected. Right? There's nothing that we're hearing that we're saying, boy, no other community has ever dealt with that. Boy, no other community has done that. Right? The exact set of relationships, the people who are here, everything about that is unique. But the larger challenges that you're experiencing, I would hope you take comfort in knowing that others have faced them as well. And again, as I said before, the block in this gives us the ability to take on those challenges. It is an entry point for making that happen. So as we think about points of convergence and points of divergence, it is important to recognize that there is a set of shared underlying beliefs that we heard routinely across this community from just about every single participant, right? And that is that the people of Fredericksburg believe they have the agency to shape their lives and community when it is built on empathy and given space to reflect, right? People truly believe here that they have the agency to make this community a better place, and that the city is capable of building a community that's more welcoming, more diverse, and more just. Again, things we heard from nearly every participant, right? And that everyone's history in the city matters and should be shared. There's widespread agreement about this, and this influences everybody's choices that they make going forward. Right? Now, people disagree down the line, but if there wasn't consensus on this, we'd have to back way up, and this process would look very different. Right? And so I hope you hear this. I hope you feel good about where the city is based on this, and I hope that others in the community also are able to recognize, and as we continue to talk to each other about these topics, recognize that this is in other people too. There's disagreements about where we're going and how to get there, but people are sharing and carrying these values with them as they go. All right, so some of the points of convergence that we've heard. Right? There's a broad-based desire to tell the whole story. People are interested. This is a town, you may have heard, that likes its history. Right? It was one of the first things we were told when we came here, and lo and behold, it is true. Right? And people like accurate history, and they like broad history. Right? So there is a desire to tell the whole story. There is a broad desire to use the slave auction block to spark reflection, to build a more inclusive city out of the process around the auction block. We regularly hear people wanting to connect the experience of the auction block to other sites across Fredericksburg. And that people recognize, as we wrapped phase 3, there was people recognizing there is a lot of work that is unfinished. Right? Our time is coming to a close, but the larger project that we are simply a small aid to has yet more ground to cover. Right? And that is both work by the city government and by community members, right? In both a top-down and a bottom-up process throughout. There is a shared desire to build trust. Many participants hold trust in personal relationships, even where there are larger divides in the city. There are a number of personal relationships that bridge, though. There is also a convergent belief in a shared mistrust of larger processes, right? A mistrust that collective action will occur, and it will occur in inclusive ways. This goes back to the thing that we heard from people from the very start when we asked them, what is your biggest fear? And almost to a person, people said that nothing will happen. Right? That is a shared worry across this community for different reasons, right? But it is, again, a shared worry. Right. Some places that people are diverging right now on what they're thinking, that we have yet to reach consensus. Where and how else to tell this story. Right? People, we've heard multiple participants and community members have come to us throughout this process and said, hey, I've got an idea for a thing here. Hey, I want to do this thing here. Hey, what about this over there? Have we told this story? Right? There's people want to tell this in other ways. We haven't decided on that. Right? Again, okay, that's where some of our recommendations will say, how do we move towards that moving forward? There is remaining divergence on where the block should be. I know this is something that there have been processes about, there have been conversations about, there have been votes about. That does not mean that it is a settled conversation in the minds of many community members, right? And people have different ideas in their heads still, and there are different ideas about how to get to that decision point. And one of the last big places that the community is still having a conversation, right, and this is truly a national conversation that you're in the middle of, right? Local history is always national history in this. It's the idea of equality versus equity. So as we move through a process like this, is the goal to try and build the equality right now that we may have lacked in the past and move through a process in an equal way? Or is the goal to move through a process in one that recognizes the lack of equality in the past by giving equity and strengthening those who have been weakened in the past in the middle of this process? Right? That is a larger conversation and is one that underlies a number of conversations we hear about elsewhere in town, but also in the block itself. So diving into a few more of these, we want to give you a little bit more focus. Right? So people agree that the block should spark reflection, that the block should help build a more just and inclusive community, but people disagree about where that should happen. Okay? It is important as you hear this that one of the things that we regularly see is the conversation is least productive when it is framed in terms of up or down, here or there. When it becomes that binary, the details of why people are making choices and the details of what they are trying to accomplish by that becomes unclear and hidden. Right? It's also when there's the greatest division, when we're not talking about values in the community we want to build, but simply that question of up or down. Right? So an example of that is that people who advocate for it staying do so for really different reasons. Right? They advocate for it as a line of defense in an effort to keep Confederate memorials up, while others advocate for its staying as the greatest condemnation of slavery that this town could put up. Right? So very different desires and outcomes that people want from that same action. So again, that question of simply up or down is not always the most clear. Right? There is, on the opposite side, that's true too. Right? We hear people who advocate for moving the block, doing so for a wide variety of reasons as well. Right? Not always seeking to meet the same ends out of that. Right? So when we say that this is unsettled, it is unsettled in a number of ways. Right? It's not just a question of one block wants it moved, one block doesn't. Right? There's a larger set of conversations that go into that. And regularly, one thing you'll see throughout this as we talk tonight, that questions about location of the block are often the way the block crystallizes larger complications in the city. It crystallizes other disagreements about how this story should be told. Right? And that's why we need to make sure that that conversation stays one that is really nuanced and keeps people talking at a variety of levels. One of the ways that we see that that divergence over who telling the whole story play out, and this is an example of how the block can crystallize these things and how that discussion about location can cover up some of the other underlying questions, is the questions about agency. And as we tell history, who gets agency? Mr. Baruti referenced that we had done a literature review of public history publications by the city. One of the things that we talked about in there regularly was who does and does not have agency in the history that is told. And regularly in the public presentations, African Americans were not given agency over their own lives, over the lives and the future of the community, past or present, in those tellings. Right? And so as people start to think about agency around the slave auction block, right, one of the ways that they think about it in particular is that is about trying to add agency into the lives of the enslaved. Right? There was another piece of divergence that we heard from at the same time in this, that people really wanted to focus on the way that slavery robs people of humanity and robs people of agency and is a really brutal and horrible thing. Can you define? Yes. So agency is the power to control in some way your own life, right? So the ability to control who you are and your fate in the world to some extent. Right? Does that help clarify that? Very good. All right. so that as sometimes those two things can be incompatible. It can be hard as we talk about the overwhelming brutality of slavery to find agency in somebody's life and in there. We sharing national trends with you. We think it's really important to try and make sure that agency is a part of this throughout, right? And that we're able to see, even in very small ways, how people tried to carve lives for themselves despite the stage that they were born onto, right? That old line in history about you may not choose the play that you are in, but you can choose how you decide to act in it, okay? There is a more, yeah.
Always ahead of us, Gay.
Yeah. This was a custom-made slide presentation, and if we were to give it again, we might make some changes where the definition of agency goes.
Yeah.
So the agency for the enslaved is nationally a challenging but a more easy conversation, the far more fraught conversation, and one that we see Fredericksburg wrestling right now, is agency for enslavers. Right? And we see this happen in kind of two ways. One narrative gives agency to people for their decisions to enslave others, and one narrative often seeks to take that away. Right? Description of people, description of the latter would be saying, hey, people were just a product of their time, and they must be understood as such. Right? They had no choice, they had no option, just was how things were. Right? And that is an extreme version. All things exist on continuums. None of these are binary statements, so people will give many range of nuanced statements in there, but that is one sort of end of that. And in that telling of that history, this enslavers did not have agency over the choices that they made. Right? Another option in this is to say, actually, people did make choices. They made choices for good reasons and bad. They made choices out of greed and out of care for their families. They made a wide range of choices, but they did make a choice to enslave people where others made a choice not to. And that discussion is another one that people are still wrestling with, right? It is one thing to acknowledge the harm that has been done to some. It is hard to acknowledge the benefit that has been given to others. And so embedded in this question is that larger national conversation again that you find yourselves sailing the seas of. Right? National trends on this are to speak about everybody having agency, both enslaved and enslavers, and recognize, yes, where people were not given the freedom to make choices, and also where they did. Three things that we talked about at the start, and you'll forgive us all, this is our longest lecture of this entire process, right? This is the longest any of you will have heard us speak continuously without asking for questions. So we recognize that that is not always the most effective way to build community conversation, but we know that this is some new material, and we want to make sure that as we start to ask questions that everyone has seen at least an overview of this. Three things that we also want to be talking about, right? Agency is one of them. Voice and scope are the other two that we see regularly still being things that people are divergent and disagreeing about. Okay, so voice is who decides which facts and what truth become the whole story for the auction block. Right? Is this an African American story? Is this an American story? Is it a Fredericksburg story? What is this thing? Who tells it? What are we telling this story about? Right? In many ways, it will probably exist as multiple of these at the same time. But again, in this is a question about power and about control of this. Right? And who is telling the story now, and who are we telling the story about in the past? And so as we continue these conversations, listen for questions about voice. Right? Who's narrating this, and what is this story that we are telling? Because that is one of the other places that we regularly see other expressions of disagreement relating back to disagreements about voice. All right. And all of this is often about power and control. history has an incredible ability to affect our present and affect our future. And as that such, as with any other powerful influence and powerful tool, people want to have control over that because it's scary or because it's really helpful or because they see the great possibility of it and they want to make sure that it turns out right. It's really important for people going forward in this to be recognizing when you might be taking power because you're nervous. And sometimes we take power because, gosh, we don't know what the outcome's going to be. So if we contain the power ourselves, we're sure the outcome will be just the way we want. That keep listening in those moments for scope and agency and voice, and keep listening for the conversations about power that are around those, right? Who's trying to exert power, what power you may be holding yourself, and how we can meet those goals of the community of trying to build a more inclusive and just Fredericksburg by saying, where can we share power? Where can we level power? Where can we make sure that power is in the hands that most need it for each decision? You want to break this up and give another voice for a moment so that they're not just listening to me? Is this one ready?
All right, so the whole story and respect. So when we talk about what we have been hearing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, all of this is very consistent, right? So we got into more nuances as we continued through the phases, but people have been talking about the true story or the whole story from the very beginning. And when they are thinking about the true story or the whole story, they want to hear the accurate history. That's something else that we heard. Now again, what is accurate history for one person may be inaccurate history for someone else. This is where people start to disagree. And so you all are going to have to decide, again, with scope, voice, agency, what that story is, right? What is the scope of the whole story that you're telling? Who is telling that whole story, right? Who has the agency within that story? It will be important for everyone to remember that everyone in the community, again, is interested in truth telling, in telling the truth. So when some people are saying, oh, you're not telling enough or you're telling too much, that's their comfort level with that whole story, but that doesn't mean that they don't want the truth to be told, right? So we want to level set that because everyone is interested in telling the truth, and we need to remember that as you all get into the depths of this.
Nobody came to any of the sessions and said, I want to put up lies.
Right. Additionally, people want to feel like their identities are respected, right? So their past histories. So some people have been living here for a really long time. Some people have not been living here for a very long time. People have a lot of lived experiences themselves, but also their ancestors as well. And so sometimes what happens when we talk about the whole story is that if we are telling this part of the story, then we feel like our ancestors have not been respected, right? Or if we tell that part of the story, then someone else feels like their ancestors have not been respected. And so thinking about how we tell the story with respect to all people, right? All people in the community. All right, so the conflict between the consensus about truth-telling and the consensus about respecting identity is that when one participant's truth is perceived as being disrespectful to another participant, right? So again, I can give an example of that later if you would like, but it's this tension that you all are going to have to wrestle with. So getting into our recommendations, we've talked about, again, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 have built upon each other. As a reminder, Braden and I have been here as a mirror. For those of you who have been to our community sessions, we've said that every time, right? We are just a mirror and we're holding that up to this community. This is what people are saying. This is what people are showing us. During phase 1, we actually gave you the quotes in the report, right? In phase 2, we had some images, some pictures. Phase 3, we continued with that. We're just giving you a mirror for what we have seen. So in the recommendations section, we want you to remember the ground rules, right? We want you to remember to be open to what is being said, that there will be some things that people really like, some things that people really don't like, and that will be different depending on who you are, right? Also, the soft skills matter as much or more than the hard skills. So as Braden was saying earlier as well, it's really easy to say, let's just vote about this, or let's just do this thing, and here's this product, right? Those are the hard skills. What is more important often are the soft skills, the coming together as a community, the listening to each other, the building of a collaborative space for people. So in our recommendations, we'll have both soft skills as well as hard skills, but remembering as we move forward that we believe the soft skills are as much or more important than the hard skills, because those will take you farther in this process.
Okay. Or do you want to do?
No, I was just going to say we broke them into 3 different parts. So one is immediate recommendations, the second is short-term recommendations, the third part is long-term recommendations. That is not necessarily a matter of how important they are, it's just how we thought we could build something on top of each other, right? So that the immediate recommendation should lay a foundation for you all in terms of bringing people together. And then as you're thinking about a little further out, once you've built that foundation, the short-term recommendations and the things that you really need to get to in the long-term recommendations.
Okay, so thinking about location, and we're putting it up front because we know that this is often a door for people, and it's a thing that folks want to be. This is one of the first things that they come to. So even though we said before that we think up or down, here or there is not the best way to frame this, we know we've got to talk about it quickly. Right? So as we think about this, right, as we look at that space, given the scope and the size of the whole story that people want to tell there, it's a really hard challenge, right? It's possible, maybe, it's gonna be really hard. So as you think about moving forward, we recommend you engage in a request for proposals, and we recommend that that request for proposals entertain proposals both for the current location and other locations. And that's important for a couple of reasons, because we think that people are still, right, we talked at the beginning about how people share a number of values and beliefs about the community that they want to build together. I think there is still disagreement about how best to achieve that. People don't necessarily know what that looks like in each location. And so people are not ready to make a binary choice yet. People still need to see more options to be able to talk to each other about their values at this point. One thing that we would want to make sure to add here is that if the block is ever moved, spaces of absence need to be marked just as much as spaces of presence. So even if you were to choose to move the block, some kind of acknowledgement of that space would be appropriate, and is something that we see as a best practice globally on objects that are moved.
All right, in terms of protection, again, this is something that we immediately saw in phase 1. It has carried through phase 2 and phase 3. I think that people were very concerned about it in phase 1. It is still a concern for sure, but we heard a little bit less of it as we moved through phase 2, but it came back up, especially during phase 3. And the idea is protection, right? So protection also went along with respect, that people were worried about what has been done to it, what would be done to it. This is not just talking about vandalism in some way or destruction, it's also people standing on it, right, in a disrespectful manner. And so the idea here is that people in the community have asked for protection. We noted a clear plexi case temporarily placed. I know that that was part of discussion early on in phase 1. And that's not the final solution, right? But this idea that you value the auction block enough to protect it in some way, at least temporarily, as this conversation moves forward.
This is moving into one of those soft pieces, right? It's easier to do the check off. Let's put the plexi over it. We can check that. It's done, right? all parts of this are going to be better when you continue community conversations around this, right? And so every time we shared a report with the community, the next time we met with people, people had really thoughtful commentary, questions, concerns, additions, right? Places that they wanted to go off of that. We think that you should do the same thing with this report as well, as you will find that same high quality level of commentary and interest as has existed over the last 9 months. Similar to that, as we come into focus for, right, we're thinking about where have we been and where do we want to go next, right? In a process like this, you can only ever see so far down the road, right? I know that the city is a very strong planning organization and you all plan years in advance. One of the challenges with processes like this is if you plan years in advance and you make all the choices ahead of time, it makes the community involvement less valuable, less meaningful, and it gives people fewer opportunity to be a part of it. So you're constantly having to be able to plan only a short way down the road, have to regather, and then with the aid of everybody who has been a participant, make plans for where you want to go next. So we see that being part of this next set of conversations as well. Right, again, how are you reacting to the Phase 3 report, and where do we want to go next as a group?
And I would just add as a reminder, earlier Braden was talking about the fact that in Phase 1 specifically, we asked people what would be your greatest aspiration and what would be your greatest disappointment. And for people, their greatest disappointment was that nothing would happen, right? So these immediate recommendations, a lot of them are really low-hanging fruit. We think they're low-hanging fruit, right? Creating community conversations is something that you all can do pretty easily just to continue the conversation. And it shows that you're doing something and it shows that it's moving forward, right? Putting plexi or some type of protection up is something that isn't relatively costly. It shows that you're doing something. It shows that you care.
That being said, we do know that there need to be structural supports for a number of the pieces of this, including moving a RFP forward, including looking at other spaces in town. We recommend that you all form committees that are, amongst people's busy lives, given specific charge to be moving parts of that forward. We learned on a phone call with you all the other day that you use very specific terms around committees and task forces and things like that. We do not use specific language, so we cede that to you all. Just know that when we write these, we mean in them, we hope that they continue to hold the values that have made the process successful up to this point, which is about open inclusion of all who want to participate in them.
All right, so in terms of the next piece, when we think about how to move forward, again, Braden was the one to talk about ground rules initially, right? So every time that we have had a discussion within the community, we have put forward these ground rules, and people have various ground rules or guiding principles that they work from. But this idea of being open to change, being respectful of people who are speaking, understanding that we are sharing the space, right? So if you talk a lot, give space to other people to speak. If you don't talk very much, make sure that you're stepping up. There are a lot of different ground rules or guiding principles that you can go by, but one of the things that we really would suggest that you do is create a set of those and have them visible at all of your discussions so that you are visibly reminding yourselves of how to work together. And that seems like something that's very simple and that you may not need, and yet it's so beneficial in moments when there are those divergent points, right? When we're having differences of opinion, calling up those ground rules are really important. The other aspect of that on this slide is that anything that is created should give agency and emphasize not just the negative impact of slavery, but also the agency, right? Those who resisted, those who survived. What we often heard was, this is just a negative story, that we only talk about the bad parts. Our children, right, speaking from African American point of view, our children don't always see the honor and the respect and the strength. And so that is coming out in this bullet point here, right? Acknowledging the resistance and the survival of that part of your community.
The flip side of that is the other side of agency and questions about horror and naming. So as we think about how much of the graphic nature of this, how much of the horror of this to share, we don't think that you should ever shy away from truth, but I don't think it is necessary to be particularly egregious in what you do put out in public spaces. Right? So be honest, but not every space needs to have every detail in it. Similarly, as you think about the idea of agency for enslavers, and that often because of the long generations in this town and how much people love this place and stay in this place, there was concern around naming in particular, right? Because there are descendants, there are people whose ancestors who look at their ancestors in many different ways around these stories. And we see that truthfully, communities come to different conclusions about that, right? Sometimes people really do want that naming to be there. Sometimes it's not, right? Again, that is a binary, and anytime you see binaries around this, try and probably avoid them and think about the larger values, right? So the conversation to have there is about, right, how do we build that just community that we want to build? Right? How do we get people to acknowledge the benefit and the harm that has happened to them and their families in the world? Some communities find that through naming, some don't. That is a point of continued conversation, but again, not around that specific binary, but around the larger goals and how that choice can meet those goals.
Again, equality versus equity. So when we are thinking about equality, it's that level playing field moving forward. When we're thinking about equity, it's an acknowledgement that it hasn't been level previously. And so giving a bump to the group that hasn't had that equality or that level playing field before. And so based on what historical narratives are currently being told in the city, based on our phase 1 literature review, right, there has been a lack of African American voice in what you all have produced so far, right? And so because of that, we are suggesting that there is prominence given at the slave auction block in particular to the African American voice, scope, and agency.
There's a lot of text on this one. So relationships remain a big portion of how this is happening, right? And what is actually being worked on in many ways around the block. Right? Part of building structures around this is to move from personal relationships that are making this happen or not happen at various moments and trying to build wider relationships that cross groups across the city. Right? In particular in that, it is really hard. This is one of those soft skills. This is not a check the box once that's done. Keep assuming good intentions from other people. Again, there's a reason we led with a set of shared values and a set of shared beliefs that we see people expressing. Again, people differ in major ways about the process to get there, but remembering those shared values will help you have conversations about process.
I think my addition to that is just to be frank, right? To say there is a reason that both Braden and I are here and have been here every time, right? There are some people who are more naturally inclined to trust and be comfortable with me. There are other people who are more naturally inclined to trust and be comfortable with Braden. That is not something that is unique to your community, right? But it is something that we at the Coalition acknowledge, and so we put out for you as well, that as you move forward and as you're thinking about this, just be upfront and acknowledge that too, right? That as we are building trust, we need to have everyone here to help build that trust as well. All right, short term,
moving through.
multiple reasons for participation. So there were, again, phase 1, we specifically asked why people were here. They had different motivations. As we moved into phase 2 and phase 3, again, motivations stayed relatively similar to the first reason that people came. That being said, when we talked about reasons for people participating, everyone was here because they wanted to see what would happen, right? They were here with good intentions. They were curious about how it all came together. Those who have stuck it through, right, have continued because they have a passion for this. As Mr. Baruti said, we had over 250 attendees. Phase 1 specifically, we had all of these new people, right? Phase 2, we had half or 3/4 were consistent, but we also had new people come. Similarly with phase 3 as well. And so I think what that tells you is that there is this group of people who have been here, who will continue to be here, but there are also, even in phase 3, people who are continuing to find out about it and who are curious and who are coming because they want to participate. And so all of that is very normal, and I would recommend that you harness that, right? That you continue to make whatever happens very public so that new people can come and be a part of the conversation, as well as recognizing and respecting the people who have been part of the conversation for a while.
One thing that we heard regularly is people would say, "Where are the young people?" Right? And they would often be there just in another session. But there was, if you were to graph the age of participants, it weighted older than younger. And as we talk about discussions about the past are really often discussions about our future and who we want to be going forward. And those are questions as we talk about the future that should involve young people wherever possible. Knowing that this has been something that has been hard to have participation on, right, looking at structured approaches to making sure that it continues to grow over time, both in when we think about young here, right, because that is always that is a movable line, right? Somewhere in the 30s and the low 40s is where young started with this conversation, right? And particularly heavily into 20s and teens would be places to target and try and make sure that participation continues to increase.
All right, when we are thinking about scope then, again, people want the whole story. That across the board, people are in agreement of. From phase 1, it's been, we want the whole story. Now, what that whole story is what has always been up for discussion, all right? So when you're thinking about scope, that's really what you're thinking about. You can't tell the entire history for every single person, all the way from when people were in Africa all the way to today, right? You can't do that, and not at Williams and Charles Corner. And so somehow you're going to have to figure out what the scope is and come to agreement about that. And so as part of that, people will need to come together. Again, we talk about committees a lot. Come together to make that decision, but then really to do research into the details of what that looks like. Because again, people say, well, I want to tell this part of the story, but they would only be able to do it in an elevator speech, right? They only know 30 seconds worth of information about that one period. And so really getting into the depth and nuance of that, not just as a local space, but as a national story as well, fitting it into the context. And so what we say here is that you should create a committee for sure. There should be academics, but there should also be community experts as well. And I think that maybe that has been a missing piece in the past. Academics are great, right? But we need to balance some of that out to figure out where all of these stories are. And it said not to be led by an academician, and that is very particular as well, right? Again, if we are thinking about scope, if we're thinking about voice, if we're thinking about agency, it should be about what stories do we want to be told, and then, yes, let's find the facts to that story. And often those who are in academics have all of the facts and they know where they want to go, right? But this is more about the community deciding where it wants to go first and then coming to this committee.
That's also, again, thinking about power, whose voices have had power. We tend to rely on academic voices. They need to be a part of this. But as we think about balancing moving forward, right? That would be one small way that you could start to say, hey, let's share power a little bit more. Okay. So one of the pieces of this, we talked about it in phase one. There are some large holes in the public history brochures, in the public history, African American history brochures. We know that there are times and places that people are doing a particularly good job of advertising them, and there are places that are not. Right? We won't rehash all of them here, other than to say that it is something that should be done more. That those should be, a number of those publications should be updated, and that they are things that should not be made special accommodation that you have to ask for. They are things that should be proudly and publicly displayed for all, and not something that you need to seek special accommodation for. Similarly with markers, there's great research from a local academic, right? Again, they're very important, who has talked about where there are and where there are not parts of this story. Thinking about this, that they should be expanded both in terms of geography, but also in terms of time. African American stories and history do not just exist in the slavery and Civil War era or in the Civil Rights era. Right? This town has been shaped and built by people throughout both of those. So thinking both in terms of geographic expansion, but also in terms of chronological expansion.
All right, moving on to long-term recommendations. One of the things, again, that we heard from phase one and has continued throughout the phases is this idea of people talking about how long they have been in Fredericksburg or how recently they've been in Fredericksburg. And in phase one, what happened that was really interesting was that people used that as a way either to show that their voice should matter more, right? Or to say that perhaps their voice should matter less. And so just using the less piece, there were definitely people who would say, well, I've only been here for 3 years, so my opinion doesn't matter as much. But here it is anyway, right? So people would use how long they had been around to talk about that voice and that power piece. And what we're recommending, again, for the long term, is that rather than use that as a measure, you're really celebrating the diversity that you have here, right? The importance of people who have been around for generations and generations, which is really amazing, as well as those who have moved here when they were children or those who moved here last year, right? Really celebrating all of that.
One other ongoing place to listen to people and try and understand why others are making the choices is how people refer to the slave auction block. Some people talk about it as an artifact, others talk about it as a monument, others talk about it as a memorial. They may not have great intention behind those words. They may, in fact, also have great intention behind the words. We hear both. Those are all different things, and they mean different things. Oftentimes, we hear people disagreeing because they are thinking of it primarily as an artifact, a place where they are seeking historical information, whereas somebody else may be thinking of it primarily as a memorial, where they and family members are having an experience about themselves, their past, and their future. Right? And those different goals for that space lead to different choices about what the future of that object should be. Right? So this is an ongoing piece, but as you talk about this, it's the idea of yes and. It can be all of these things, right? So if it is an artifact, yes, and it can also be a memorial, yes, and it can also be a monument, and use yes and in these conversations.
We've talked about this a lot already. In terms of what we have seen from phase one all the way through phase three, this is not just about location, right? It's not just about Charles and William Street. But what we have seen is that people have been asking for multiple locations to say there are a whole lot of stories that we want to tell, a whole lot of things that could be told. And so in this aspect, we're saying, yes, go ahead and think about what all of those spaces are, Sometimes they will be physical spaces, but they can also be digital spaces as well. And so thinking about how you can create that through a website, how you could do a podcast. There are a lot of different types of things that you can do, that it doesn't all just have to live in this one space, that really for your community, it can be very broad because you do have a lot of history and you do have a lot of depth here.
All right, and this is the last one. We are deeply appreciative of you all in your busy lives giving us so much time to share this, right? We've had such rich conversation from the community. It takes us a while to unpack it all for you, right? But that is, we hope you see just a reflection of the depth of thought and care that so many community members have put into the process. And so the last thought that we would have for you all is that in our work around the world, we have been to some of the most beautiful memorials and monuments that have been built and do not impact their community because nobody uses them. And we have been to places where a group of people makes an incredible effect out of an empty space, right? And that these places are not just about the physical structures we choose to put there, but they are about the behaviors and the use that we consciously commit ourselves to in them. And so as we ask you, as you think about the future of that space and other spaces around town, that you also commit to building in planned and structured use of that space to achieve the goals that people want to achieve. And it's those times and moments where people come together annually, every month, whatever that may be, however you choose to create that, and rededicate yourselves to a set of values, to each other, and to a mission that these places often hold their highest impact on a community. So going forward, don't think of this as just an inanimate object. Think of this, the necessity of building in ritual for the community as well. And so with that, again, thank you so much for giving us such time to share at length the nuance, but we're happy also to now, I think, turn it back to you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Questions and comments from council? And this is a working session for council, but this small group that is in attendance tonight has been faithful and involved. And so if there are questions after the council discussions, if there are questions or comments from the group, we'll welcome that as well. Councilor Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've been jotting down notes and read it earlier today, so I might be a little bit disjointed. But first off, I think it's appropriate to thank you very much for all the time and effort you all put into this. I've attended a number of the meetings, and they were always very informative. And you're right, you need to look at different perspectives and understand. And we should, frankly, in any decision we make, understand different perspectives. Because frankly, understanding those and dealing with them hopefully will result in better decisions, and I think that's what you're talking about. I will agree in that this is right now a smaller conversation that is going to become a broader conversation. And I understand what you are saying in that we need to be very careful in how we proceed to make sure everyone has a voice at the table as we move this forward. Because again, we're going to go into other topics as are in most places in this country. And so this process, we need to move to where we maintain it and maintain that community consensus. What has always been difficult, and frankly is difficult right now in this country, is when building community consensus, that pretty much means leaving the room not totally satisfied because you are going to make some concessions, understanding what others believe, to try to address those concerns. And that is the way it should be done. Unfortunately, today, we don't see it. You're right. Right now in America, it's winners and losers. It's not, how do I address your concerns? Will you understand my concerns? How do we come to something that we can agree on? And I think we need to continue to move on that front. The auction block is just one point, again, of a bigger story, and I agree with you on that, and we need to do a much better job of that story. And it gets to one point that I was interested in when you talk about, is this African American history? Is this, African American white history? Is this Fredericksburg history? I take a little issue with that. For me, and I've said this numerous times before the council, I don't like the way we approach history. If I were to define this, I would define this as community history. How this community, as a microorganism in a greater nation, faced the issues that we face as a nation as we went from our founding to where we are today. Because I think we really lose the fact, and it is a fact, that we as individuals who will never get our names in the history books or a footnote or anything, frankly, are the ones that have moved this nation forward or backwards. You know, we have great leaders, they have great vision, but ultimately it came down to people leaving their homes as teachers, policemen, laborers, sitting in ranks, 13 inches between ranks, 125 yards, shooting at each other, people getting on a bus, going down to the south and getting attacked by dogs, water cannons, lynched. All that was individuals who made the conscious decision to do something. And I think it's very important for a community to, as it brings up the next generation in the community, that they understand what they may be called on to do to keep us moving in the direction we want to go. And I think that gets lost in the way we teach things. That sense of the Civil War, I don't care, the American Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, the children in Fredericksburg need to understand that their mothers, fathers, grandparents, great-grandparents played a role in that, and they too may be called to play a role in that. And I think it comes into part of this discussion. So, and again, why it's important to maintain that community involvement in the process, because, again, to me, history is not, oh, I read a story, I know about the battle. I'm a Civil War reenactor, put on a blue uniform, I can tell you every battle, I can tell you most casualties, troop movements, commanders, and everything else like that. But that's not really what is important. What is really important is how people move forward to move this nation forward. And when we talk about the story, and I agree with this, there is concern that we are focusing too much on slavery. And I would agree that that is not the way to go. We have a lot more history, even African American history. We have a free black community in the city of Fredericksburg that was operating for a great period of time that did a lot for this community. We had the civil rights movement and the participation of some people sitting in the audience with us this evening who were critical in moving that forward in this community. And there's also cautionary tales that come out of this. We come out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and we have the African American community meeting down at Old Site Church to nominate the first members to run in a city council election. And you had that short period of time of where everything seemed to be going in the right direction. Yet, even after hundreds of thousands of Americans lost their lives to get us to that point, we started to backslide. And that's a cautionary tale. You know, everybody says, oh, this will never happen again. Well, I'll bet you that 1867, 68, as things started looking good, everybody goes, we finally got past all this. We're moving into a brighter future. And by the 1890s, into the turn of the next century, we were almost as close as we could get back to where we started from. Why did that happen? That, I think, is a very important question, that people understand that we think of history as, oh, that happened, it won't happen again. It can happen again. And the community needs to understand that, and people need to understand that they are going to have a role in hopefully making sure things like that never happen. Which, to the point of the auction block situation, I agree with you, and I agree with everybody here, that trying to tell that story on that site is not possible. There is absolutely no question that's the case. That we do need to tell the broader story around it, and that could be different sites and everything else like that. But the one thing I would say that, in fact, we had conversations about this through the different meetings for me, is you can take something and you can really do too much. You can just overwhelm it. Because I think what really makes some things like that particular, we'll call it memorial, because I think it is truly a memorial, is when people stumble on it in a setting of 21st century America and they look at it and they go, oh my God, that happened here in that context, which to me results in revulsion, pain. I know that's another issue that has been brought up with it on numerous occasions. And hopefully that also results in, what is my obligation? What is the action? History should be motivating people to take action and understand that they have that role to play on making sure things like that never happen again. So I really do appreciate all you have done. I agree with you, we have a ways to go. I agree with you that compromises will be had to be made as we move forward and as the discussion continues. But I do believe that this is one of those topics that we continue to move forward. Might be a little slowly, but I think bringing the community, the whole community along for this discussion and coming hopefully to community consensus is imperative, because once we get through this discussion and get things lined up, there are more discussions, and I think everybody realizes that are going to come. And we need to make sure we are still united as a community as we move forward. Because again, and I know Charlie and I have had radio interviews and conversations all along, and we might disagree a little bit on how we approach this. I think it is important to point out that we all want to go in the same direction. We're all going to try to make this community better, to move us forward to what was originally our founding fathers intended us to be. And we still have a ways to go, no question about it. And this helps us find where we've been, where we are, where we need to go, and what our obligations are as individuals in this community to get us there. And I think keeping that in pretty much the way you outlined it is a good way to go. And I thank you very much for all the work you've done.
Councilor Duffy.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to thank you too for your presentation tonight. I think it's very helpful. And I also obviously want to thank everyone involved who participated in these discussions. And I just, at this point, really want to share how much my feelings about this issue have been affected by the discussions I've had with people along the way. And I'm grateful for that. I'm a little heavy-hearted today because of it's been a rough week in Fredericksburg, you may know. But I just want to say I'm hopeful that the conversations we're having will help us to go forward in a trying to choose my words here. In a way that we are more arm in arm, more understanding, more sensitive. I believe I'm getting there. I think this whole process has changed me some, and I'm grateful for it. And I hope it can change the destiny of the city, that it really can be a more just place. And so I realize the great challenges ahead of us. We know about them. But despite the difficulty of the challenges, I am heartened by the eloquence of your presentation and by surely the eloquence of the conversations that were responsible for creating that presentation. So again, I am very hopeful about the destiny of this great little city, and look forward to talking more about this. As Mr. Kelly said, I think very well that these are the kinds of conversations that healthy communities always need to have, and it's been too long delayed, and so I'm grateful to be a part of it, and I thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilor Devine.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll add my thanks to Dana and Braden, and also to those in the community who have spent a lot of time addressing this issue really thoughtfully. And I think that that's obviously something that we need to do. Again, I appreciate the conversations that we're having in a very open way. And in this era of misinformation and fake news and just I think having those tough conversations face to face, being able to acknowledge different positions, being able to acknowledge strengths and weaknesses, I think those are all very important. I'm a teacher, and I work with high school students, and it's been interesting, and I agree that I would love to see more young people involved. You specifically pointed out like high school and college age students, and I think that would add to the discussion immensely. So I would really love to see that occur. And I'm not quite sure, these great young people that we want to involve are so involved in everything else already. So it's really hard to, have them give up more, of their time to involve themselves. But I think that is an important piece that I'd like to see. So I think we have to figure out how to do that. Meet them on in their turf, their settings a little bit more. Again, I have a lot of thoughts going on in my head. Again, in teaching history and psychology, we've talked in class about why people make the choices they make and how people deal with, their struggles and so forth. And I think that I know that it sparks big conversations in my classroom at times when we talk about, famous studies and conformity and Milgram studies and Nuremberg trials and all those things. Why do people do what they do? And how do we get past some of the atrocities and things that have occurred? And so I'm hoping that this work that our community is doing gets us even further past that. And I do hope that the emphasis in all of these discussions and future brochures and whatever way we get this message and story out is a story of beauty and resilience and strength. Because I see that in our community. And I so wish and hope that that continues, the strength and beauty of our community, and that we can get to better understandings of each other and hopefully agreement. Agreement would be wonderful. Moving forward with a common voice would be wonderful. But I think at least understanding and appreciating where people are coming from. So again, I think I agree the greatest disappointment is that nothing would happen. And I don't think that is happening. I think we've taken those first steps and we'll go on from there. I just want to say I attended some of the early meetings, and I'm going to own that I chose not to continue to attend some of the meetings. And I want to explain that because the early meetings, I felt like people were talking to us as council members and not to each other. And I felt in some ways that our presence was a little bit hindering some of the free discussions and thoughts and ideas that were coming out of the groups. And so I do want people to understand that I feel very passionate about coming to a better place with this. But I'm very glad that members of the community have gotten very involved in it. Because I don't think we should necessarily always be the filter and the mouthpiece for the entire community. I mean, it's part of our job, but getting others to step up and be involved is an important part of community as well. So thank everybody. I'm sorry I've been rambling, but thank you all for everybody's passionate work.
Billy. Vice Mayor.
Thank you,
Withers.
Vice Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Vine has said a lot of the things that I agree with. I think from the beginning, it's no secret that I've been opposed to moving the block. But as we've gone forward, I still am opposed to it, but I've softened on that. So I will go with what I believe the community wants to do. And I'm opposed to it, and Charlie and I talked about this the other day. I think moving that takes away from the memorial that should be designated to the folks that suffered these atrocities. I think moving it to another site is, and if that's what the community wants to do, I will not try to block that. I hope that people remember that we're trying to honor those folks that were horribly mistreated. So thank you guys. You've brought me around a little bit. The community has brought me around quite a bit. So thank you for your work, and we will move forward with this. We're not going to forget this. Okay. Thank you.
I'm gonna, Mr. Graham and Charlie, and then I'm gonna call on Gay. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam Mayor. I guess I just want to start, again by thanking all the time that you've spent here in Fredericksburg. I might be newer to the process. I wasn't here when you first started, but I've been reading all of the transcripts, and like Councilor Devine, wanted to make sure that not to interfere with the process, let the community feel free to speak their minds. So thank you so much for the discussions that you have brought to our city. It's been an amazing experience, and I think a lot of people have grown from this, and a lot of people have learned very much, not just about the community and about our history, but about themselves. So thank you for that. I also just want to go on the record as personally endorsing your recommendation that we strive for equity and let the African American community drive a large part of this effort. One of the things that I learned a long time ago, back in high school, I was the minority at my high school, and it didn't give me some sort of deep perspective that a lifetime of being a minority in a country would do. But what it did give me was the opportunity to get to know people on a very deep and personal level and understand how different their experience and their perspective can be than mine. And I'll give an example. We've seen time and again over the past few years of racial tension around interactions with law enforcement, and when I was a teenager, I got pulled over for running a stop sign in my neighborhood, and the police officer that pulled me over basically treated me like his son, gave me a stern lecture, but sent me on my way. And that's not the lived experience for so many people of color in our country. You hear about people having a talk with their children about what to do with law enforcement and how different that can be simply based on the color of your skin. And that was something that I just had no experience with and had no knowledge of. And there's no way for me to internalize that because I will never be in that position. I just can't. And what I think that we need to recognize is that so much of the history in this country has been built by, or at least for, white people, predominantly white men, and there is a lot to be said for, those of us in this position to take a step back and not just hear what people of color are having to say about this, but give that decision-making power to those who, for so much of our history, that decision-making power has not even been there. And so I want to go on record as stating that I believe that the African American community should be taking an outsized role in this, and I will support the recommendations that you've put forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Greenlaw. I was probably wanting to get my finger up early because everybody knows how I feel. So I didn't want to end it by, saying, get the block out of here. But that's how I really feel. And that has never changed over this course. So I didn't want to be the last voice of saying, hey, y'all heard it now. You heard everything. All 3 reports are in. Let's go get it out of here. But that's how I feel. But let me just throw my I won't say 2. I got some eyes rolling at me the other night. I say 5 seconds or 2 cents or 5 cents. Let me say 5 cents of comments here. By growing up here in Fredericksburg, and I understand history, and I understand the big scope of history and the stories and so on and so forth. And by growing up in a city that's so rich in history, the fact that, the conversations that I had about history, Black history, is a lot of verbal. When I went to school, that's not the history that we got. And right now, that's not the history that's in the books. So, by hearing about, George Washington and so on and so forth in Fredericksburg, that was the reference that I always had to use when I talked to folks from somewhere else about Fredericksburg. I had to mention George Washington. And even growing up and growing older, didn't know about, how slaves were really used and so on and so forth. I always knew about the block, and it started to, I was curious back when I started understanding things a little bit better. And the block, from everyone that I was around, was always the most, horrific thing ever. I talked to somebody today and, on the phone, and they said, good luck tonight, give it your all. And, they still can't go across the street. Somebody who grew up here as well, that's older than me, way older than me. And, I have to take that in consideration. And, it's hard for me, to say this, it's not personal. It is personal, because, I'm a voice in the city now, and I have personal experiences with the block myself, and growing up here, and have a long history of family here in this city, where I reside at now, Mayfield. It was annexed. It used to be Spotsylvania County. So I have long-standing history in this area back even to before the city was annexed. So the folks that I'm talking about that I got my verbal history from, because it's not on the books, have been here, a long time, and it's always been a negative thing. And I believe in, not to talk about religion, I believe in a higher power, and I also believe that somehow I get to channel, some of the folks in my family that didn't have a voice. And I noticed that. It's not saying that I have this special gift, but I noticed that when I ramble, because a lot of times when I ramble, it's uncontrollable. So it's kind of like some of these things that have been put in me, they come out on their own. Everybody knows, you won't see me writing notes and speaking off of a script. It's not going to happen. That's probably why I talk so long sometimes. But, I believe that those stories come out at the right times. It's like, when you're telling somebody something, like, when is that going to be useful to you? And I believe, strongly that happens with me. And the pain, it's hard to describe, the pain. I grew up in Fredericksburg in the 80s. I was born in 1978. And I still remember by Captain D's, the place called the Step Down, where if you were black, it's a thrift store now, where black folks used to come through there, and they would throw beers at your cars and they would spit at you. And folks that were around and during this time, they know what I'm talking about. But it was quote unquote as a redneck joint. And if you were black and you came through town that way, you had to come through town that way. It's before we had all of these extra highways and the Blue and Gray Parkway, So like I say, it makes me feel old. I've just seen a lot of change in Fredericksburg. And I remember going up Lafayette Boulevard, because to go to Fort Mount Fork, you had to go up Lafayette Boulevard. And I remember the KKK up there by Old Greenwich, where it's 2 lanes at. You have to go that way. And, you know, and it was always this intimidation thing in the city of Fredericksburg that I grew up seeing. And I'm not saying it's the worst in the world. But I mean, from what I saw, it was always separation. That's probably why I'm so big on Parks and Rec, and make sure I volunteer and all of that as a grown man, because for me, in the city of Fredericksburg, that was a time when everybody came together, and it didn't matter. You threw a ball or you did something, and that was the togetherness part. But when you go home, there was separation, and that's just the reality. When you got on the bus, there was separation based on where you live at, and you know, all of that. When you go to school, there was separation based on what classes you take. Who knew about placement back then? You know, how did I go to school with graduating with 100 and let's just say 100 kids, small city? But how did I go to school and go from K through 12 with the same kids, and 40 other kids I never had class with? You think about all of that, you know. Now I'm the guy who was sitting in the lower classes myself personally, and I'm the one that's sitting on city council. Go figure. You know, I'm the one that didn't go to college, and so on and so forth. I'm that one. But when it comes to grouping and how things are done, there's a separate system. I do strongly believe that it's way different now. I'm just giving everybody a perspective on me and why. So probably a lot of people want to know why. Why would he try that, or whatever the case. I also strongly believe that a lot of these stories that I'm saying now, or these internal things that I'm saying right now, with all due respect to all the Ward 4 representatives before me, they didn't have those ties. So it could be the first time, you know. Mr. Turner had family in the area, you know, so on and so forth. But, you know, a lot of this wouldn't come up because a lot of folks that were, it hasn't been many on the city council, minorities. Maybe 5, you know, 4 or 5. One of them was father and son. How did that happen, you know? But it's just the reality of what we have in Fredericksburg. So probably this is the first time where somebody had enough guts to try it, you know, what's happening right now. And that's what I believe. Because, you know, if you didn't, like what was described today, you know, if some folks say, well, I just came here for a while. I've been here for a couple of years. And, you know, that probably does make a difference when you know, if you don't understand or you haven't lived that history, you know, that's been passed down. So it's not my job to influence other folks on what to do here. And, you know, everybody's decision is what it is. But like even with economic development, I've been quiet a long time about, you know, because like I said, for me to say I'm that open that, yeah, it's personal. And I look at everything that we decide on in the city. That was one of the reasons why I was so happy to have something like Sedona come downtown, because I knew when I saw it and when I started doing my research, you know, it wasn't about it was about the restaurant, not necessarily Sedona. Nobody knew anything about Sedona, and I'm not trying to promote that. But any type of restaurant like that, I knew it would change the atmosphere of downtown. If you go to Sedona, you'll see a mixed crowd. If you go to other places, you know, you won't see that as much. And it's just a reality, and I kind of could see that. And I have friends that I grew up here say, well, why am I going downtown for? Because folks don't feel welcome, you know. And you go downtown, not everybody wants to see, you know, and this is a historic city. It's all my ward as well, but not everybody wants to go out and be reminded of those times. It's just a reality. It's like something that you should almost choose. But if you go into certain parts of the city, it's there in your face at all times. And people don't get a break from it. And it's like the slave block. You could be having a great day and you walk up on that. And then the stories are interpreted ever how you want to. So that also was a big problem for me. And by growing up here, and I didn't want to go through my whole life history, but I mean, I think it's worth it. But the slave block, you can stand there and tell your own story about it. And I would say, based on the fact that nobody in the city ever did anything to try to fix that thing, you know, nobody ever stepped up and said, well, what is this? Well, what do we do? I watched it on the news one day, and they were on the trolley tour. I don't know who the driver was or whatever the case. They showed it on the news. And whoever the speaker was, it was on the news. I can't make this up. It came down William Street, and it said, to your left, there's a slave block. You know, like is that how we, you know, is that what we do? You know, it's like, wow, hey, by the way, you know, you know, now's here why you bought the $6 ticket. Right there on your left is the slave block. So, and everybody was like on the bus, wow. It's like, you know, and that's our fault, you know, as a city. That's our fault for not, you know, putting it out there. And right now we're at the point we're having this conversation, and it's a deep conversation. I believe that the slave block conversation should be the slave block conversation. Whatever happens, happens in the future. But the slave block conversation should be the slave block conversation. The African-American history that we're missing ourselves, that we're not telling in the city, that's another story. But it's our job as well. So who would thought 2019 we'll be talking about how to tell, you know, Black history stories or whatever the case. And I'm just, like I said, my job is not to convince any council members. I appreciate you guys, you know, agreeing to go on the journey, because we didn't know what the journey was. Let's be honest, you know. And of all people, Mr. Kelly seconded the motion for a slave block removal. And I told him last week, I said, hey, without a second, it dies. You know, so even Mr. Kelly, you know, when I said get it out of here, a lot of folks have never heard about the conversation if we didn't get a second on it. We wouldn't have had a vote if it wasn't for a second. So, you know, I have to give you credit on that, you know, for allowing me as a fellow council member to express myself on my views, you know. So with all of that being said, I said my 5 cents worth. With all of that being said, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to the community. And to see folks that, a lot of people that really know me, they call me Little Charlie, if y'all believe it or not. But I see these folks that are doing this process, and they say, well, Little Charlie, you know, I'm glad because I never talked about it. I never got to get it off my chest. And I think a lot of people who went to the meetings, they saw it. They saw what was happening there. So just the fact that a lot of people are now openly talking about it is a big deal. And, you know, we couldn't have did it. We did it together. We really did as a council. We did it together. And it was tough for me after the vote. And I'm just being honest. It was tough for me because I was like, what in the world is going on here? I'm the only one that feels like this, you know, and that's how I felt. But, you know, I had to suit up and we had to go to work at the same time. And I never changed, you know, my views or whatever. But I do know that, you know, for us to move forward, it has to be addressed. And I mean, that's pretty much all I have. Thank you, Mayor Greenlaw, and thank you to everybody that participated. And that's it for me. So we'll see where this goes, you know, from here. And like I said, I don't want to influence or whatever the case. So we'll see what the next steps are. So thank you.
Thank you. Tanya, is the mic working on the podium? Yeah. Gay, if you would approach the podium and use that mic, because this is being recorded, so your words won't get on the recording if you don't use the mic.
I was a school teacher. I could go back there.
Yeah, I get accused of using my school teacher voice sometimes in here.
Well, I'm born, raised, still live in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and I love Fredericksburg, Virginia. And the first thing I want to say is I want to thank the council members. I want to thank all of you for what you do, the work you do. I sat here one night while you were listening to the baseball stadium presentation and was like, oh my God, I couldn't take it. I could not take it. So thank you for what you do. And then secondly, thank you for investing in the coalition. I made this statement at the last meeting, and Mayor Greenlaw was there. I don't know if anyone else from council was there, but it was real important to me that you invested in an African-American issue. There's so much nowadays about diversity, 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 but we are the only minority that did not ask to be brought here. And so as things become, for an example, when the Black Arts Festival turns into a multicultural festival, when we did have 20 slots to perform and celebrate our culture, now we might have 2 or 3. So I don't know that I can buy into all of diversity. What I do want to say is that, like Councilman Withers, I've changed because I wanted it to stay in the same place. I wanted it to stay in the same place because every time I walked past it, and I grew up on Amelia Street, 2-3 blocks from the slave block is what we call it. I saw it all my youth, probably more than all of you collectively put together. And so I wanted it to stay there because every time I saw it, it fueled my fire. And it stoked my fire. It stoked my energy for a better thing. But I changed because I heard from so many Black folks about how painful it was to them. And while you might want the pain to continue to be felt, I ask you this: would you vote to support blackface? A lot of people were just abhorred by blackface and would vote against it today or tomorrow because of the pain that it causes Black people. Well, blackface is a picture in a book, and you only see it every once in a while. But that slave block is on the corner of a major thoroughfare. We see it all the time. We feel that pain all the time. But it's like it didn't even matter, the pain we feel. But you can get all upset about blackface. And I don't quite understand how you can't get upset about the pain that Black folks feel when we pass the slave block. I changed my mind, and I want it gone or moved, and I want the whole story told. I must say, however, congratulations, thank you. I don't know how you boiled it down to this. I don't know how you organized it like this. I'm a school teacher. I don't know how you concised it and made sense out of what was often nonsense to me. But I'm trying to be open and inclusive and embrace diversity. However, and I'm just focusing on this, I look at, we need to immediately schedule several conversations. So my question is, who's going to do this? And then I look over here and it says, oh yeah, we got to get some young people. We need a high school committee and a college committee and a young adult committee. And my question is, who's going to do this? And I look at, we have to define the scope, and we have to determine the scope, and we need some academicians, and we need some ordinary community people. And my question is, who's going to do this? And it says that we need to take all this into consideration and get it into the history books and the tour, and we need to get it into the brochures, and we need to get it on the websites and the films. And my question is, who's going to do this? So I'm thinking that if we can find money to give tax breaks to a baseball team, then maybe we can find the money to find someone who can, in fact, do this. Because that's my question. And I know you support the equity. I support the equity. But I feel that most Black folks in this community right now are going to put all their energy, I know I am, maybe Lori is, maybe my compatriots in the NAACP are, but I know my energy is going into the upcoming election. and I won't have time for the slave block in the coming months. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gay, for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you too. And I told Braden, I said he's so dressed up I could take him to Shiloh Old Site on Sunday.
How about that? Well, I will say this. I am like Gay. I'm pretty impressed with the organization and the way you've put this forward. But most of all, I appreciate you're giving us language. You're giving us process, the rules, and how to, maintain them. You said at the beginning that this community is showing a capacity to work collaboratively in an increasing amount as you work through the process. And that, to me, is very encouraging. Gay, you're absolutely right. Who's going to do this is, I'm pointing at the city manager and the staff, but we've said, but we've said all along, I know that Mr. Baruti and I have had conversations that we may be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on revising our history and the way we proceed and these important dialogues. We're going to have some help. We can't all do it in-house, and we can't, all of our good citizens can't all do it either. So it'll take some organization, and it may take some professional help for that organization. But you're absolutely right. I think this document and the seriousness of the conversation that we had and what we all feel as a really encouraging ability to make this a better community, that it's worth it. So it's just as important as economic incentives because it's our future. And Mr. Baruti's not, he said, I've heard him say, we're going to be spending a lot of money on this, and that's okay. That's okay. It's important. So again, thank you for giving us language. Thank you for giving us process and a document that can be a working document. I appreciate the very specific recommendations that are in it. And I am no longer afraid that nothing will happen. I know that something will happen and that it will be good. All right, okay. I got two anxious people over here.
No, not anxious.
Who wants the last word among you two?
the last word.
Okay, it's you, Charlie.
And Mayor Greenlaw, you just ended this perfectly. So in typical fashion of myself, this is a work session, so I had something that I just wanted to share. Like I would in a work session, the council meeting, then I wouldn't, but this is a work session. But you just did a good job. I don't know if you can repeat everything you just said, but that would be nice to close it out again. But I was working and I was thinking, and I was like, this whole history thing and the whole scope of what we have to do, and in budget season, and it's a lot that goes through our heads. It's a whole lot that goes on, and I was thinking the whole time, I was like, this, considering the fact, it's not just to keep pointing fingers, but considering the fact that the city hasn't done much, if we were upstairs at the table, that's what I'm saying, I would say this, it's, to me, it's easily worth a penny on the tax increase to designate a penny's worth of tax, if it was real estate tax, whatever the case, and I know this is budget season and I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes, but to me, it's worth a penny in the future if it was almost designated that we did our job to tell it. And then when the question is, how do we do it? If we can't invest a penny in the African American history in the city, we're not doing much at all. And that, in the same respect, what happens with tax increases and so on and so forth is what a lot of people understand where you say, well, a lot of the minorities, it's hard, which is the reality. It's really what we deal with. It's harder for lower income folks to pay these taxes and all of it. But over the course of the years, we raise taxes. We have to. and things happen. But I think that it wouldn't be an argument, from the lower income folks that is in some situations we say, well, we can't raise taxes because these folks can't afford it. I think they'll be happy for that type of increase to know that, even for senior citizens to know that, hey, I've been here all my life. You have people that have been in their homes and been homeowners for 50 years here in Fredericksburg or more, a lot more, and it's almost just that scenario of, I think it'll be worth a penny in the future. And that money could be allocated to make sure that we do it, because at the end of the day, that's what it all comes down to. And I would hate to be sitting here and voting on riverfront parks and everything else that we do to enhance the city, and without anything on the book saying that we'll support African-American history at some level. So when it comes to that cost, it's like that's the cost. And a penny is nothing for what the magnitude of what it would do. So as a work session conversation, I just threw that out there on the table. So we'll talk about that in the future, and I'll talk to staff if whatever the case, but treating it like a work session, and it just popped in my mind earlier, and I wanted to throw that at the council. So thank you, Mayor Greenlaw.
Council Kelly.
Giving the Irishman the last word, dangerous thing to do. One of these days
You're
we're
right
going
about that.
to have to
Giving
take
you
an
the last
average of
word's
the
a
time
dangerous
that
thing to do.
is spent speaking in council meetings in these two chairs.
We keep talking about getting a little egg timer and putting it up in front of Matt when he starts to speak.
No, actually, it was just going to be a recommendation that, at this point, Mayor Greenlaw and Councilor Fry and the city manager have been kind of overseeing this process, and it would not be a bad idea if you all at least got together again and put some ideas together and brought it back to council. I mean, you started this process. It makes perfect sense for you all to continue looking at it and coming back to us with what you think the next steps and when they will be. If that's not a problem
I'm up for
with
that. Are
anybody.
you,
Oh, yeah.
Chuck? Okay.
And that's it.
If everybody else agrees, Councilor Duffy?
I just want to comment on Mr. Fry's statement. I agree. We need to take advantage of this investment of time and effort and thought, and really the courage for people to talk about their experiences as you have tonight. We need to put the kind of investment in that's financial as well, and not just the hard work of volunteers and citizens who come to talk to us about this. And I think that, moving forward, we need to try to make this city what we want it to be. And, as great as it has been, certainly our collective vision here, as we've seen through this report, is that it could be a lot better. And so I look forward to talking about that. Thank you.
Carrie?
Sorry. We do have a long list of recommendations, and they're, prioritized. But I guess if we're, and I guess that's what I assume would happen, that, the committee would kind of take these recommendations and come back with us. But it does seem like there are a few that are immediate,
Right.
such as protecting the block and so forth. So I guess, I know that we need to figure that out, the process going forward, but perhaps, again, not to charge you with that, but I assume that you would prioritize the immediate ones even further, so.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, it's laid out here for us,
Yeah.
I think, for the immediate steps. Mr. Baruti?
Madam Mayor, I was just going to say to the conversation to the council and you that we would be happy to spend obviously significant staff time on with you and Mr. Fry putting together. Well, let me back up. First of all, after tonight, no later than tomorrow, we'll post this
Oh,
online.
I wanted to say that. Good. You're going to
And-
make this public.
Yes, the video as well as the report, because we're just seeing it for the first time. At least the public is hearing about this report for the first time. So we'll post it now, and we're happy to come back as soon as April with your help, Mayor and Mr. Fry, on an implementation plan that we think makes sense, and at the same time maybe ask council to endorse by resolution or accept this report by resolution, And in that same resolution, we can identify those next immediate term steps. So we'd be happy to put time to that to create some structure and give clarity on immediate next steps and maybe mid-range next steps.
Excellent. Okay. I think we have concluded our work session. I can't thank you enough, those of you who have participated throughout the process, but Braden and Dina, you really have done a remarkable job, I think. And I appreciate so much your allowing us to learn a lot about ourselves. I really do. But I'm passionate about this community. For the most part, we try to talk and listen to each other in a way that's healthy, and we can be better. So, thank you very much.